Welcome to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers' Fest. The Vancouver Writers' Fest connects people to exceptional books, ideas, and dialogue through year-round programming that ignites a passion for words and the world around us. I'm Leslie Hertig, Artistic Director, and I'm very happy to share this conversation featuring John Freeman in conversation with Mieko Kawakami, Daniel Mendelsohn, and Valzynha Mort. This event was recorded on October 14th, 2020. The Vancouver Writers' Fest carries out its work, including this event you're about to listen to, on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We would like to thank our government sponsors, CMHC Granville Island, the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Government of BC, the BC Arts Council, and the City of Vancouver. And now, John Freeman, Mieko Kawakami, Daniel Mendelsohn, and Valzynha Mort. Welcome to What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, a celebration of Freeman's latest volume, Love. Many of you already know John Freeman as a great friend of the Vancouver Writers' Fest and is the editor of Freeman's anthology, published twice yearly. He's a literary critic and writer of essays and poetry collections, including the newly released collection, The Park. John is joined today by three of Freeman's contributors, each writing in different genres and from three separate continents. Please welcome Mieko Kawakami, Daniel Mendelsohn, and Valzynha Mort. John, over to you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. It's so nice to be back in whatever way we call this as being back in Vancouver. I just remember how many events began with a heavy rainstorm and a quick run from the hotel over to one of the event spaces. I dearly wish we could all be there because the writers that you have very kindly allowed me to gather here tonight are exceptional in three very different ways: in the novel, in criticism and memoir, and in poetry. And I particularly wanted this group to get together because we've been living through such a time that is the opposite of love, in which rhetorics of hatred are being piped down every single sort of tube that could possibly be, dripped into our ear. And if anything, I think we turn to literature for complication and complexity, but also for the embrace that feels like love. And these writers all do that in their own way. Mieko Kawakami was born in Osaka in 1976 and began her career as a singer and songwriter before making her literary debut in 2006 with her novella My Ego, My Teeth, and the World, which was nominated for the Akutagawa Prize. The following year, she published Breasts and Eggs, a novella which won the Akutagawa Prize. She's also the author of Heaven, The Night Belongs to Lovers, and the expanded version of Breasts and Eggs, which was just published in English this year. Daniel Mendelsohn is a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books and the New Yorker. His works include the memoir An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic, and The Lost, A Search for 6 Million, as well as three collections of essays and criticism, most recently Ecstasy and Terror, From the Greeks to Game of Thrones. His new book is called Three Rings, which is an extraordinary nonfiction work about the way that Homer instituted a way of storytelling which has carried through all of literature since then, and which Daniel describes discovering himself, not just as a student of the classics, but as someone who is living, needing the organizational structure of the ring method of storytelling to both get him out of a book that he was lost in, but also a period of life. And finally, Valzynha Mort is the author of Factory of Tears and Collected Body. She's received the Lannan Foundation Fellowship, the Bess Hokin Prize from Poetry, the Amy Clampett Residency, the Gulf Coast Prize in Translation, and the Glenna Lushai Prairie Schooner Prize. I feel like I should get a prize for pronouncing all of those things without stumbling. Born in Minsk, Belarus, She writes in English and Belarusian. Her new collection, Music for the Dead and Resurrected, will be published very soon in November. It's a joy to have all of you here. I'm going to start by asking Mieko a question, which is, how have the events of the last year changed or clarified for you what love means? As in, how important is proximity or physical intimacy to love for you?
本当に想像もつかない状況に世界中が巻き込まれて、人に会ったり、これまでしていたことが人の例えば命とかを脅かすことに急に変わってしまったわけですよね。
The world has really gone through unforeseen circumstances this past year. Things that we did every day without thinking, just like seeing someone, transformed into something that endangers the lives of other people.
で、例えばこう死に別れる時であれ、最後に普通にこうランチとか会った時にさよならっていうと、その別れっていう概念をも変えてしまった。
So, for example, it's really changed the meaning of goodbye. So every time you have lunch with someone, for example, and then you say goodbye, it has a different weight than it did before.
で、これから本当にワクチンも開発されて、どんどん、回復に向かっていくっていうふうに信じたいんですが、
And I'd like to believe that a vaccine will be created and the world will go to a better place.
これまで疑いもしなかったことが一度は変形してしまったっていう記憶は個人の中に残っていくと思います。
But the fact that how we understood the world and what we understood as the norm has changed, that kind of shift will forever be engraved in our memories.
で、その中で愛について考える機会は、やはりこれまで私がその愛について考えていた方法とは違う方法で愛というものについて考える機会を得たようにも思います。
And so this opportunity to think and talk about love today, I think has given me a chance to think about love in a different way than I would have done only a year ago.
それは少しちょっと奇妙な説明になるんですけど、息子と一緒に暮らしていて、抱きしめることのできる、唯一のフィジカルが息子なんですけど、息子を抱きしめながら、例えばもう二度と会えない、死んでしまった人のことをよく思い出す数ヶ月間でした。
And I'm going to give a kind of a strange example, but I have a son that I live with, and he is the only person in this world that I can physically embrace right now. And as I'm embracing him, these past few months, I've been thinking about all of the people that I can no longer embrace, those who have passed.
生きていて二度と会えない人と死んでしまって二度と会えない人との違いは本当は何なのかと、愛を中心にそういうことを考える数ヶ月でした。
And I've also been thinking about what the difference is between those that I can't embrace even though they're still living and those I can't embrace because they're dead. I've really been thinking about those questions these past few months.
Thank you.
Thank you. Daniel, this event is titled What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. And I feel like if anyone in the world I could ask this of, you in particular would have some thoughts on separation and love, since the Greeks are full of this in their stories, in their myths. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about what happens when love is entwined with separation, what that means for the possibilities of drama. Are there stories from the Greek myths and from Greek literature that tell us, what comes of that separation, where it leads us?
Well, it's funny. I mean, like so many people, obviously, I've been thinking about this sort of cruel ironies of separation that have afflicted us because of this pandemic, and particularly, the idea that of necessity, people are physically separated from the people that they love. And of course, in the most extreme cases, illness and death, people cannot be attended by their loved ones, which I think is particularly devastating. And, it's funny because in my first book, I reflected on this a lot. The myth I always come back to, and this is sort of connected to the piece that I wrote for you for this issue, which is sort of not about love, but about distance, the inevitable separation, the distinctness from the love object that we are doomed, as much as we try to unite, to be separate. And I always think of the myth of Narcissus on the one hand and Echo on the other, which are famously connected in Ovid's Metamorphoses. The idea, whatever else Narcissus, the myth is about, and it's been sort of psychologized to death, obviously. The idea that you look at the love object, but it disappears every time you try to come close to it, which is sort of the curse of Narcissus, because he doesn't realize that the love object is himself, and so there's this sort of tragic inability to connect, which I think is so interesting, particularly as a Hellenist, as somebody who's thinking more about Greeks and about Romans. There are very few works of Greek literature about happy marriages, that it's the separation, it's the necessary tragic distance that provides the most fodder for the Greek creative imagination, at any rate. These desperate stories of hopeless distance, inability to connect, it fires the tragic imagination necessarily. And I think about that a lot now, as I said, because we are in this kind of unbearable way, it reminds you of other famous myths like Sisyphus and Tantalus, these sort of terrible, undoable tasks, the idea that when your loved ones need you most, you cannot be near them, physically near them, I think is one of the really awful things that we're all thinking about right now. And I've certainly thought about this distance and closeness problem a lot. And I think it's a very Greek, it certainly obsessed the Greek imagination.
I'm glad you mentioned the sort of love object in Valzynha's second book, Collected Body. You have this line: what is love if not a need for a beholder, a witness, if not the possibility to be immortalized in the story of another? And Valzynha, I wonder if you can talk about this notion of love, say in the context of a childhood spent, as you describe it in a piece we'll be running shortly on Literary Hub, in a Soviet microregion. You write, the school hallways were brightly lit while the bulbs inside the apartment entrance were always out, and the staircases stood in the dark like still water. The elevator smelled of urine, and the school corridors smelled of chlorine. But then suddenly your piece, it swerves into tenderness. And the next two paragraphs, and I don't know if you have it there in front of you, but I was wondering if you could read them, because it's like you've folded from, looking at something from a distance to looking at it from the inside and loving it from the inside.
Yes, thank you, John. I'm very happy to be here. I love being here. A lot of the things that I know about love, I've learned from Daniel's work. So I love that I'm facing him now.
Thank you.
So could you tell me which paragraph you would like me to read? And I will do that.
There's one that begins, is there anything more beautiful than night in a Soviet microregion?
Okay, yeah.
And if you could read that paragraph and the one that follows, because I think they set up a really interesting collapsing of the sort of love object idea of love.
Is there anything more beautiful than night in a Soviet microregion? Thousands of windows light up, transforming concrete panel blocks into the hanging laundry of light. Mothers lean over the stoves. The night sky reflects the glow of electricity. I would like to walk through it as though a carpet market, moving the hanging carpets of apartment buildings with my hand. The air smells with mothers, their perfume, their hairspray, in their purses, lipstick, a loaf of bread, and a used public bus ticket. There is always a girl swinging on a creaking swing and cutting the air with her feet like a butcher's knife. Who is she? Isn't she mad from that creaking? Does her swinging wind the clocks in the apartments? A bedroom window faced away from the apartments and into a state dental clinic. Across the street from the clinic, there was a round cemetery the size of a small garden. Once the cemetery plugged the village, now the patch of old trees looked disproportionately small next to the densely populated apartment buildings. The clinic took no appointments, first come, first serve. In winter, I'd wake up for school at 6 a.m. and people would already be lined up. From the top of a bunk bed on the 6th floor, I'd sense human movement in the outside dark. In a DNA-like ribbon, each human link was a swollen mouth of pain.
God, that's so beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. And it continues to explore violence because the history I come from is the history of violence and failure. And when I was looking for a poem to submit to this very timely anthology on love, I thought of the Greeks actually, and I thought of Sappho and that bittersweet feeling of a love that is already lost the moment that it appears. But then the summer and the events in Belarus over the summer have completely changed my idea of love, and it moved from me thinking of something intimate and private and erotic to thinking of love as a political act, as an act of political activism. Because coming from that kind of culture of violence and loss, we were never taught to love ourselves. On the contrary, we were taught to be indecisive, inconfident, doubt ourselves. It was really about self-hate. Why did it happen? Well, we were also taught not to trust anybody, of course. And I remember in school, the children that would be congratulated most were the ones who were able not to trust, were the ones who were able to cheat and trick others. And that kind of a bully, right, was somebody who we were invited to look up to. And why did it happen? I got to thinking, because of course we were brought up by a generation of orphans, underloved people who were themselves brought up by a generation of underloved orphans, people who lost their parents, their family to great violence, to great terror, people who were encouraged to betray, to report on their own family. Right in school, we celebrated Pavlik Morozov for betraying his own family. And so in August, after the Belarusian presidential election, when great violence erupted and people were tortured and murdered in police custody, it triggered all of that history of violence. And suddenly, instead of not trusting each other and self-hating, we just kind of loved. We loved each person who was detained. We loved each wound that we saw shared in these pictures and videos on social media. And the solidarity, that kind of horizontal solidarity that never existed in Belarus, it sprung from that, from loving people, loving each other, saying that we deserve better, we're human. And that immediately brought around trust in each other, relying on each other. And that led to political solidarity, which is not even political solidarity, just human solidarity. And my friends who are in Belarus and who describe being inside this huge marches where thousands of people march together, they say, I've never felt so safe in a huge crowd because I trust everybody and I love everybody and I feel so loved when I belong to this huge body, which takes us immediately back to that idea of intimate erotic love. It takes us to Cavafy and some of his beautiful poems of erotic love where two bodies become one in a room. That kind of a sense, and I was just fascinated how the ability to become one with a lover, how it translates into this political context, and how we can also be non-erotically, but also feel how we are a part of a one body with a huge crowd of strangers, and we trust and feel safe inside it.
I'm going to go back to Daniel before asking a question of Mieko. That was a beautiful answer. And I couldn't help but thinking, as you were speaking, Valzynha, of that Martin Luther King quote, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." And since you brought up Cavafy, I wanted to go back to Daniel briefly before talking to Mieko. Daniel, I've adored your translations of Cavafy, but it seems to me one of the pressures on his erotics was to some degree their failures or their ends. He's often looking back in a way, and he's looking back at an impossibility. He can never re-enter that experience. All he has is the memory of it. And I guess I wonder if you agree of that sense. And I guess I also wanted to ask you to talk about the pre-nostalgia in Cavafy's erotics. Since you, Valzynha, you just also talked about it, the sort of nostalgia for an experience before it's even ended. The pre-nostalgia of the poetics, maybe, of gay life to some degree. And if you've ever wondered if Cavafy's poems gave a form for that which, for a variety of reasons, does not necessarily need to exist anymore because certain liberations have occurred.
It's so interesting. I mean, there's as you were talking, Valzynha, my head was spinning actually, because I'm probably going to fail at what I'm going to try to do here, but because I want to start with your remark, Valzynha, which tries to connect love to politics, essentially, to sort of alchemize the erotic into the political. And one can do that, and you just did beautifully do that, actually. And one can also do it by means of metaphors of bodies, literal bodies, bodies politic, right? We use the language of bodies to talk about politics. And so one can go a further step from that, because what you're also talking about just now, Valzynha, is history. And Cavafy is a poet who is deeply interested in, I want to make up a word, the historics of Eros. You know, this idea of retrospection as essential to a certain kind of erotic sensibility. I think it has to do with a historical moment in homosexual sensibility, certainly. But I also think it has to do with modernism at the beginning of the 20th century, which Cavafy was his period, as it was Proust's period, and they share a great deal in this sense that there's a sort of double-edged, you know, a coin with two sides. On the one hand, that the moment you attain the object is always a moment of disappointment. And that it's only through retrospection that you can really understand the love affair, right? That's happening always in Proust, and it's happening always in Cavafy. And so I guess I hadn't expected to think about Cavafy tonight, actually, but I think what Cavafy is interested in is time, actually, more than desire, more than history. You know, people always divide his poems into the erotic poems and the historic poems. And I always think nobody thinks that way, you know, except critics, you know. But it's all about one thing, which is retrospection. You look back at human history and then you understand it. You look back about your own love affairs, and then you understand it, which of course, because of the force of Eros, it's almost impossible to understand the contours of the experience until it's over, you know. And so this is, you know, very mushy, but I feel like I want to get to a point where I can talk about love educates us, because love is always, or our experiences, love, both political and personal, let's say, is inevitably also an experience of disappointment. Nobody is always successful in love. Well, there may be people, but I don't want to know them. And that the disappointment is part of the schooling of life. And that therefore, all these things somehow come together. There's this sort of educational, you know, the education of the sentiments that helps us to be individuals in our affective lives, but I would say, to come back to Valzynha, also in our political lives, you know, that one has to have a sort of view of things, and one can only have the view when it's over, in a funny way. And I just, before I ramble on too preposterously, I just want to flag one thing that you said, John, which is, you know, one could say of Cavafy that it's a poetics of disappointment to some extent. You know, almost all of the affairs, I can't even think of one that's successful, actually. They're always over, they're disconnected, they're ruptured, and I think it's possible to say that, as you said, because there have certain liberations taken place for gay people, or certain gay people at least, in the early 21st century, that the sense of claustrophobia and impossibility need not anymore be a constitutive element in how gay people imagine desire. And in fact, it was funny because my piece for your love issue is really a Cavafyian, I guess. It's about the disappointment, about the impossibility of connection. And I'm sure that's a product of the fact that, you know, I'm a gay person of a certain generation whose earliest experiences of desire had to be disappointed. It's interesting.
Thank you. Mieko, I wanted to ask you a question about breasts and eggs, because we've been speaking about the body and politics. And in that expanded version, which came out recently, you meditate, among other things, about the female body and how it can support and even look like the byproduct of love. You know, desire on the one hand and childbearing on the other. And the book thinks about the pressure that puts on an already pressurized form, that form being the woman's body. For those who haven't read it, in the first half of the book, a character is going to, I think, a city to get breast implants. And then in the second half of the book, her daughter is trying to get in vitro fertilization support so that she can have a child. But back to the question, I guess I wonder what, for you, what liberation from some of that psychological weight on the female body would look like. Is it possible?
すごいいい質問をジョンありがとう。そうだな。まず今英訳されてるブレス・アンド・アグスはフェミニズムの小説だっていうふうにたくさん読んでもらってそういうふうに紹介されることが多いんですね。ただ私はやっぱり人間について真剣に書こうと思ったときにやっぱりその女性の側面についてを通らないわけにはいかないっていう気持ちがあったんですよね。
Thank you so much, John, for the wonderful question. So the Breast and Eggs novel that has been translated, it's often introduced and called a feminist novel. And there are, of course, elements of that. But when I set out to write the human experience, I realized that it's impossible to skip over the experiences of women.
で私はその海外で住んだことがないので、日本の例えばそういう女性に対する差別、あるいは日本は島国だから人種的な差別はもちろんあるんだけれども、それを直視しないで社会を形成してきたっていう背景があるんですね。
And I've never spent so much time abroad, but in Japan, of course, there is discrimination, especially kind of racial and ethnic discrimination. But because Japan is an island country, we've somehow gone through without having to directly discuss those important issues.
国土の割にすごく人口が増えたから私たちは多言語、特に英語を学ばなくても経済も回ってきたし社会を形成することができたんです。ただもうそれが終わりつつある。これはもう誰の目にも明確であって私たちは大きな変革を迫られている。
And Japan has such a big population of people that speak Japanese, and so we never had to really learn English in order for our economy to succeed and for our society and culture to flourish. But everybody can see now that that era has come to an end, and there has to be some important major changes in Japan.
だからブレス・アンド・エクスを読んだ時のその海外の方の読者の驚きっていうのは日本は日本人とかあるいは日本文学が提出してきたものって少し奇妙で高貴で変わったそしてなんていうのかなおとなしい親切な隣人っていうイメージそういったものの文化として受け取ってきた側面が大きいと思うんです。
And so I think one of the things that surprised overseas readers of Breast and Eggs was that it overturned this image of Japanese literature that has been translated and read until now, which is that image that Japanese literature or the world that the Japanese literature has presented is a country that is a little bit different, a little bit strange, but a very kind and gentle neighbor.
そういう人たちが頭の中で奇妙なことを考えてる。なんかちょっと高貴ジャパンみたいなところがあったんだけど、ブレス・アンド・エクスを読んだ人たちの驚きっていうのは、日本にも不幸があって、格差があって、貧困があって、こんなにもはっきりした女性差別があるんだなっていうことにみんな驚いてくれました。
And so one of the things that I think shocked the readers from what I've gathered is that people are realizing that Japan too has issues of poverty, of economic disparity, and really rampant discrimination against women.
ただ、日本は本当にいろんな今国の作家と話をしたりとか、ジャーナリストとの取材を受けたりしてるんですけど、ちょっと考えられないぐらい、 ジェンダーバランスとか、その性差別に関しては、もう本当に先進国とは言えないありさまなんです。
And I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of writers and journalists from overseas these past few months. And I'd like to say that Japan is really, really behind on gender issues, the gender balance. You wouldn't imagine it from being such an advanced, so-called advanced country.
もうジェンダーギャップも本当に下から数える方が早いし、みんな本当に例えば女性の体にまつわることも全部男性が決めるのね。例えばピルが買えないとか、結婚したら名字を男性に奪われるとか。
And if you look at the gender gap ranking, Japan is easier to count from the bottom. And there are so many things that everything that is related to the female body, all the laws are created by men. So, for example, you can't easily buy birth control pills in pharmacies, or if you get married, you have to automatically change your family name. You have to lose your family name.
だからジョンの質問に最後答えると、その抑圧や重荷からの解放は可能かっていう質問に答えると、私はやっぱりもう今のもう向こう20、30年はやっぱりこのままで、今の子供たちの教育に本当に全てがかかってると思います。
So to go back to your question, to answer your question about whether it's possible to be liberated from the pressures on the female body or what that would look like, I think the next 20 or 30 years or so, I cannot see a major change. I think it would really depend on the children who are being educated now.
かなり厳しい状態ですね。
I think it's a pretty dismal outlook.
I wish the answer were different, and I'm sure you probably do more dearly than me. I'd like to build from that and talk to you, Valzynha, about your poem and the issue, which is a really clever piece of kind of rewriting the gaze. It's called The Poet's Biography. And maybe you could just read it first, and then we can talk a little about it, because I think it touches on some of the reversals that Mieko, I think, dearly wants.
Yes. Poet's Biography. I picked your book from Sandeep's shelf. The poet's biography read Lives and Teaches. Though the book was fairly recent, it was no longer true. I almost met you once. An almost meeting I remember clearly because of my embarrassment. I was having loud sex in a hotel room while you stood knocking at the door, wanting to give me your book. Now the trains stand frozen in a winter storm, and I pity the trains as if they were shivering butterflies, a whole herd of them, the last of their kind, stuck in the snow England has never seen. Sandeep is cooking dinner, you're dead, the lover's gone, your book in my frost-bitten hands.
Thank you. I wonder if you could just talk about what that poem is doing, and maybe what some of its, if you can reveal, what its origins are.
Oh, poets do not love to talk about that. But I read your introduction, and it was actually very helpful to me myself to understand what is happening in the poem. When the reversal here, right, where there is the speaker having sex, so living a life, a lived experience, while a senior poet insists on handing his book over to this younger poet, saying, stop having sex, sit down and read a book. And but then and so that's the reversal you discuss in the introduction, asking what is more important. But I have to say my favorite reversal here, if I can have a favorite reversal in my own poem, is the moment of a metaphor where trains turn into butterflies. And there, of course, it seems there cannot be anything crazier to imagine the opposition between this large machinery sitting on rails and butterflies shivering, fragile, small. And why is this reversal happen? Why is it happening? So I asked myself, because you wrote about the reversals in the poem. And so I decided to think about it. And I wonder, how did I come up with this idea? Well, it has to be poetry here. It has to be that kind of blurred vision that the book handed to me then, and that is about to quote me again, only the author of it is now dead. I think this is what is blurring the vision and turning trains into butterflies, and these hands holding this book, that they are frostbitten, and it's probably not just with frost of the winter storm that they're frostbitten. Now that I'm talking about it, you see, I do not think of it, of course, writing it, but we talked about Cavafy and erotic love, and I think of a bite now as something actually very erotic. But what does it mean to be beaten to frost or by frost? But then, so I kind of now try to refuse to talk about my own poem. And I mentioned Cavafy again, because I have next to me a book by a poet who really loved Cavafy. It's Joseph Brodsky, who was a great reader of Cavafy's. And when, I don't know how I ended up just keeping his book next to me during this conversation, because I love his love poems. And they're so lyrical and sentimental in the best way sentimental poems can be. And all of them are kind of too late. They all come too late. The lover is already lost. But when I heard Daniel talk about time, and the way that love measures time in its own way, it immediately took me to the opening of Brodsky's poem that is called 6 Years Later. And it begins with, so long had life together been that now the 2nd of January fell again on Tuesday. And this very nostalgic sentiment where time is measured by love and not by the social measurements that that are given to us, and we accept them. Like right now, it's gonna be here Halloween, then Thanksgiving, and the Christmas decorations are already on sale. And this kind of time measurement, it's imposed on us, it's everywhere, but kind of we do not really choose it. But measuring time by love, by times of being in love, by how long we've been in love with somebody or out of love with somebody, is that maybe a kind of, it's not necessarily a refusal, but it's certainly an alternative to the social time, an intimate time of measuring, of measuring our life by loves. And but it is, I think, a kind of a rebellion. It makes me think of yet another poem by a Polish poet, Wisława Szymborska. She has a poem called True Love. And in that poem, she goes, oh, wait, I had it open there. It says, true love, is it normal? Is it serious? Is it practical? What does the world get from two people who exist in a world of their own?
I love that idea of the kind of, rather than the traditional calendar, the love calendar, because it is a very fractal sense of time, depending on what kind of relationship you're coming out of. And Daniel, I wanted to ask you a question now, because your new book is so much about time and how time is ordered in storytelling through the ring structure. And, you make the point in Proust that Swann's obsession for a courtesan kind of provides the template for obsessive love that the narrator later develops. And so the use of a ring-like structure isn't just simply a way of kind of repeating. It's a way of modeling for some people what love can be. And I guess I have two questions here for you. One, could you describe what the ring structure is, as briefly as possible? And then how does it change the way we think about love? Does it mean that we automatically think more about time? Does it enable us to think in greater ways about obsession?
Well, so ring composition is this technique of storytelling that's very characteristic of Homer, and it is the sort of central motif of my new book. And it's actually a very normal way of telling a story. So you're telling a story, and halfway through your story, you have to interrupt yourself. So that's story number one, let's say, the main story. And then, but you're halfway through and you realize you have to interrupt yourself to give some background that helps you understand story number one. So you sort of cycle back in time to story number two. And then while you're telling story number two, there may be a backstory to the backstory that you need to explain. That's story number three. So then you finish telling number three, you circle back to number two, and then you finally end up where you started in one. And so it's a way of opening up bubbles within narrative. So the narrative, instead of going in a straight line from A to Z, is sort of looping. It moves forward by going backwards constantly. And that's ring composition. It's great for many things. Look, it's an early form. You have to remember that Homeric narrative is oral. It's pre-literate. It's pre-writing. And so this is, in fact, how we tell stories quite normally. And it's a very good way of incorporating flashbacks, right? You imagine what a flashback is before long prose narratives were invented, But it is a very good way for narrating obsession, because obsession is necessarily repetitive. And one could say even healthier kinds of love are repetitive, right? Where we're creating a model or looking for some original in our love objects. And so ring composition, which moves forward by cycling backwards, is a sort of an ideal narrative mode for talking about certain kinds of love, right? And I'm also thinking of, the points we were discussing before with Valzynha, the idea that the sense of recapitulation, or that you don't understand the shape of a thing until it's over. So that's quite often the point of a ring narrative, is that only by looping ever farther into history and telling the backstory of the backstory of the backstory does the whole shape of a narrative really become revealed. But that's a narrative process, which is very interesting and fun. But it's also ultimately about psychology, one could say. I mean, that's how analysis works. right? There's a series of doors that keep opening and that you have to know how to get to the door. And when that door swings open, you go ever deeper. So I think it's funny because we talk about rings and one imagines, as one talks about this kind of narrative, one imagines shapes. But I want to somehow work into this model the idea of depth. You know, I always think of Russian dolls, you know, or Chinese boxes, you know, and it implies secrets, right? There's always the implication of a secret, which is fascinating because the ultimate secret is the other. The ultimate secret in life is the other. And that's why we cannot get away from these metaphors of, which are also literal, obviously, of penetration, right? That the other is a hermetic entity that you have to get into in order to know the secret. And so it's interesting the way that these narratives sort of, certain kinds of narratives, and certainly this kind of narrative, which keeps delving ever deeper and farther, you know, both vertically and horizontally, one could say, is a kind of metaphor for both the psychology of love and one could almost say the act of love, right? It's an attempt to keep going further in order to know the other, which is the ultimate secret of life, a person who is separate and yet with whom you want to be united, the impossible dream.
As you were speaking, I was remembering a review I think you wrote of the Charterhouse of Parma, which was translated by Richard Howard. And your description of ring composition also sounds quite a bit like gossip, as it operates within the novel of a certain time and place, and how a novel driven by secrets and gossip can also have an immense amount of depth.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can think about that in terms of love as a social vector as well as an intimate one, as in, you know, love is more or less possible depending on who tells what whom.
Well, it's actually so interesting. I mean, I'm not going to get this right tonight, but it's a very provocative, you know, idea that on the one hand, when we think of erotic love, we think of privacy, selves, you know, interiority, blah, 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 you know, but it's so interesting about love that we want to narrate it, you know, as it is both everything, but also infinitely, you know, everything in the sense of being bound to someone and realizing one's, you know, innermost desires. And yet it's so interesting that it is social, right? There is a social dimension as we live it, because what's the first thing you want to do when you do meet someone? You want to tell people, right? You want to tell it. And so there is this impulse to narrate. And as you say, that is a kind of gossip, right? And so I'm not sure where that's going, but it's a really interesting thought that I'm going to spend the rest of this evening thinking about, you know. But that, I think, you know, it's so characteristic of love, and you know, you were talking before, Valzynha, about Sappho. You know, Sappho in the Western tradition coins the word bittersweet, right? Although in Greek it's sweet bitter, actually. And that, you know, that essential quality of love, which is always two opposite things at once. You know, the two that are one, the private that wants to be public, the self that wants to connect to other, you know, it just seems somehow so fundamental. And look, why are we here tonight? We're in our different ways, we're all narrating love for a public. So there you go.
Mieko, I'd love to ask you a question on the back of that. You know, because we've been speaking quite a bit about romantic love and the desire for another love objects. The excerpt of your novel Heaven, with a capital H, which appears in the issue on love, and it's a really beautiful glimpse of friendship as love. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that as a form of love and whether or not it has to deal with the divisions we're talking about, of that you cannot become one, because in friendship maybe you can.
なんかその今お二人のお話を聞いてて、この質問に答える前に考えていたことがあって、そのさっきの質問の前の質問の時に、ちょっとその日本は割とクリティカルな状況だみたいなことを話したんだけど、やっぱりそのダニオが言ってくれたみたいに失望とかその辛さとかそういったその不安定なところからやっぱり文学とか詩っていうのは生まれてくるから、市民としては本当に気がめいることが多いんだけれども、小説家、あとポエットとしてはもう全然この状況は別に絶望的でも何でもないんですよね。
So listening to the two authors speak, before I answer your question, John, I was thinking about what I said earlier about Japan being in a critical situation, and of course, disappointments and anxieties, and that's where literature is born. So as a citizen, I think I face a lot of, it's a discouraging situation, but as a writer, it's not a discouraging situation at all, because that's where literature is born.
それでジョンの質問にもあるように、その友情と愛の関係、その最も深い形になれる可能性について考えるときも、やっぱり時間っていうものと愛は深く関係していると思います。
And to go back to your question, John, when thinking about the relationship between friendship and love, I think the key word time that's been coming up, I think is central to thinking about the two.
で、やっぱりそれはどのような人間の関係でも、思い出との関係でも、今現在進行しているものに対する理解と、過去になったものに対する理解っていうのには、やっぱりそれは違うものとして残ると思う。
And so when you're thinking about human relations, how we understand what's happening in the present and how we understand what had happened in the past, those are two different things.
だから、友情でも恋愛のエロティックな愛でも、やっぱり渦中にあるときは、その人が本当にただ中にあるときっていうのは、その本質をつかむことっていうのはなかなかできないんじゃないかと思う。
So whether it's friendship or erotic love, I think when you're in the midst of it, it's really difficult to get at the essence of it.
だから往々にして人は過去のことや自分の体験をやっぱり特に言葉にするときに美化してしまう恐れもあるんだけども。
So when we're thinking about the past and narrating our past experiences, we tend to kind of beautify the experience.
そういうんだけど、でもそれが本当に嘘かどうかっていうのはやっぱりどのレベルから見てもわからない。それを証明することはできない。
But whether that beautified image of the past, it's impossible to prove whether that's false or not.
だから今度そのラブイシューに掲載してもらった男の子と女の子の友情っていうのはすごく振り返った形で書かれている小説ですよね。
So in the excerpt of my novel that was published in the Love Issue, it depicts a friendship between a boy and a girl, but it's written from in a retrospective light.
だから愛は現在として生きることもできるんだけれども、同じような強さでもって私たちは保存することもできるんだと思う。
So love, of course, can be lived in the present in a powerful way, but I think we can also preserve the memory of love in an equally or even more with more strength.
だからもう会えない人との交わした愛情や友情っていうのはそういうものとして私たちは何度も体験することができる。これは人生に与えられた大きなギフトの一つですよね。
So love or friendship that we've exchanged with another person, this can be experienced over and over, even after that actual experience has passed. And so I think that's a gift that we've been given as human beings.
Mieko, I'd like to ask a follow-up, because we've been speaking of Homer and Sappho, and Daniel mentioned that Sappho coined the term bittersweet. There's a beautiful book by Anne Carson called Eros the Bittersweet, which I think you would like. My question to you is this: are there traditions within the very long history of Japanese poetry of speaking about love? And I wonder if you can characterize them for us. You are a poet, and I wonder if writing your own poems, you responded to these traditions of how love is addressed.
みんな一番有名なのは源氏物語。
So probably the most famous example is the Tale of Genji.
源氏物語とか、あとは詩歌で短歌、俳句。
And there are other forms of traditional poetry called tanka or haiku.
で、源氏物語はすごいちょっと独特な背景があって、宮遣いの人たちが人が書いたもので、そこには本当に、男性を中心とした、ラブロマンスが描かれている。
And Tale of Genji has a unique setting. It's written by a lady in waiting, and the characters are all members of the aristocracy. And it's a love story that unfolds surrounding a certain man.
もちろん女性のことも描き尽くしている。
And of course, it depicts so many different women.
でも私の考えでいくと、それはやっぱり古典はそのような例えばラブレターを送り合うんだよね。歌を送り合う。直接会わずに。
Yes. So in the Tale of Genji, as with other literature of the time, the lovers never meet in person. They send poetry. They send poems to each other.
でそれがその愛の深さを技巧とかテクニックとか言葉遣いでその人の人となりと、あと愛のなんか証明になってたんだよね。
And so that's, poems were the means by which the depth of the love that this person is feeling is judged. And so it was the use of technique and, characterization. All of this became what you judged a person's love by.
でもある時から日本のポエットは特に歌だよね、俳句をやる人っていうのはなんか人間の感情とか人間への愛とかっていうよりもやっぱりすごく見たもの、見えるものとか自然のやっぱり描写するっていうことにすごく特化されたんですよね。
But from a certain point in Japanese history, Japanese poets, especially haiku poets, began to depict not only emotions or love, but nature of what they observed with their eyes.
で今現代はやっぱりみんな自分の気持ちばっかり書く短歌が多いんですよ。短歌に関しては短歌がすごく今若い子やってて。
And in contemporary Japan, actually tanka, like poetry, is on the rise, and so there are a lot of young poets, but they tend to write about their emotions.
でもやっぱり俳句が持っている、俳句は絶対季語っていうのを入れないといけなくて、それはもう人間よりも季節とか社会じゃなくて世界をやっぱり俳句の世界の基盤に置いてるんですよね。
And in haiku, there are some rules, and one of them is that it has to have a seasonal word. And so more than one's emotion or, even society, it's this nature, the cycle of nature that becomes the central kind of rule within haiku.
それはなんかソサエティの時間とか人間関係に流れてる時間みたいなものを本当に忘れさせてくれる大きな時間、あるいは動かない時間みたいなものを思い出させてくれるから、私にとってはすごく俳句に触れる時間、そういう短詩系ですよね。自然について書かれたものに対して触れるっていうのは独特の時間に触れることと同じことだな。
And so reading haiku reminds me of this much larger scheme of time that is very different from, social time or even personal time. And so I really cherish these experiences of reading haiku because of the experience, the different experience of time that it gives me.
Can I say something?
Yes.
I'm so fascinated because I'm actually right now in the middle of reading the Tale of Genji. And it's so interesting because, to mention Genji and haiku in the same conversation, you have Genji is so expansive, it's so gigantic, and it's also like a catalog of different kinds of love. Unhappy love, requited love, homosexual love, heterosexual love, and it encompasses everything. And it's so fascinating what you're saying, Mieko, about, and on the other end of the spectrum is haiku, which is very compressed, very formal. And, it just seems that listening to what you're saying, I was so fascinated because it's as if these two ways of talking about love or alluding to love sort of run from one end of the spectrum to the other, the enormous and the tiny, and compression and expansion. And I was just very struck by this. And also I'm reading a very old English translation of Genji, and there's lots of footnotes and one of the things that the translator feels that he must explain is this business of sending poetry, which I guess he assumes is so strange to an Anglo reader, that these lovers are always sending each other poems and quoting poetry, and it's a prose work, but the poetry finds a way to become part of that. Absolutely fascinating.
I have to say, if someone listening to this doesn't commission Mieko to write a capsule history of Japanese expressions of poetic love from Tale of Genji to current haiku, I think we've failed. I want to ask the final question of Valzynha, because I note we're probably running to the end of time. And Valzynha, you have a book coming out called Music for the Dead and Resurrected, which I absolutely love. And it has this wonderful poem in it called An Attempt at Genealogy. And I bring it up because we've been speaking a lot about time, and it has this repeating line, but where am I from? And it's an effective device because, in part, you're partially talking about love for a place that doesn't exist anymore, about loving a ghost, if you will. And I guess I wonder if you could read some of the poem, maybe, and just talk about, how, as a poet from a place that has changed dramatically, how you have to relearn how to love where you're from.
Thank you, John. This is so perfect to plug my book, but instead I want to talk about what Daniel and Mieko were talking about. Because I was very moved by what Mieko said about companionship and friendship. Mm-hmm. And I thought how we're talking right now about love, but we're also talking about literature, and how Daniel said earlier that love is always a disappointment, but literature is not. And I think that literature compensates as a companion, right? A writer compensates as a companion for what our lover fails to give. And then when Mieko talked about friendship and companionship, I thought back on my poem from your love issue, Poet's Biography, that I read earlier. And I thought how, of course, it is a love poem to companionship, to a friend with a bookshelf who is cooking dinner, but also to this book that is waiting for you outside of a hotel room and is waiting for you on a bookshelf. And it's there for you. Your lovers come and go, but the book is there and it provides you the companionship that the lover does not provide. And so here's what I wanted to say instead of talking about my new book. But I could read quickly. It's a very long poem, and it's about coming from nowhere, having no legacy. Perhaps, John, because there's so little time, maybe I could just read the very final one. I cannot hear
perfect.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, just the final one.
Section.
So it's a very long poem trying to understand one's lineage that is absent, and about absence is an inner organ, and about the absence of graves. I think it's it's something that some American readers can relate to. I think there is that kind of absence of graves post-Holocaust, post-Black Atlantic, and in this case, post-Stalin's terror. So the search for them can turn the poet sometimes into a gravestone, or you keep creating these cenotaphs with language. So I'll read the very ending of this poem, and if you want to read the beginning, you have to get my new book. Put your bones into braids of graves, woods. Put your bones into braids of graves, ravines. Put your bones into braids of graves, fields. Put your bones into braids of graves, swamps. Put your graves into braids of bones, mother. Put your graves into braids of bones, moth. Put your graves into braids of bones, ghost. Put your graves into braids of bones, guest. Braid your bones neatly. Braid your bones bravely. Finger comb your bones into neat braids in our woods, ravines, fields, swamps.
Oh, it's so wonderful. I really hope Leslie was being serious when she was promising we could all come back, because I would love to have part 2 of this conversation. I have lots of questions I wasn't able to ask of you because your answers were so beautiful and complex. But I would give an inner organ of absence. Is that what you said? I want to have your superpower of speech just for a day, see what reality feels like. But I would love to see all of you together in person to see what happens, hopefully, when we're out of this period, and how love feels then. I want to thank Mieko and Moako. Is that how I pronounce your name? Hitomi, sorry, for coming. Thank you very much for helping us speak across language barriers. Valzynha and Daniel, thank you so much for giving up parts of your night. This was, yes, we're all showing, you can't see this on the podcast, but we're all showing little hearts.
You've been listening to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers' Fest. To hear more events like this one, please check out our website at writersfest.bc.ca.